Welcome
Yep.
back.
Okay, thank you.
So we left off just after we'd talked through all the different rules of AFL and all the different games and found the correlations between them. And my next note simply says the idea was to simplify play and control excessive violence. And these were the things that were at the heart of the new rules.
Absolutely. And again, I immediately think of the Aboriginal game, Marngrook we call it now, and they were the essential features of Marngrook. There was no thuggery or anything like that. Anybody getting knocked down was entirely accidental. People would fan out to positional play, then have pack marks, all that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
And the whole idea of the game was to keep the ball in the air and to keep it and not do anything that would bring it to the ground.
No war.
And the early Aussie rules that Tom Wills forged just mirrored that perfectly.
Well, that's what my next note says, because someone else actually said that Tom preferred the rugby rules. It was never Tom that said that. It was someone talking about that years later. So I've got here that Tom wrote to his brother Horace and said, "Rugby was not a game for us. We wanted a winter pastime, but men could be harmed if thrown to the ground, so we thought differently." Later, Tom would want a crossbar as part of the goals, and also when a player gained a free kick near goal, he wanted the best kicker to be able to take the kick.
I think one of the important things also is that in Australia, most people playing the sport were working men. Back in England, people playing sports were the upper crust.
And the schoolboys, yeah.
Yeah, that's right. And so it didn't matter if they got hurt. But in Australia, if you couldn't work, it was a serious matter. So they had to have a game that didn't have this gratuitous violence in it.
I remember from Tom Brown's school days, just after that match in the book, the kid gets injured and he gets sent to this, not the stockade, what do you call it?
The infirmary.
The infirmary, yeah, to recover after it. It's crazy. The idea of running the ball in for a try was not a part of the Australian game at all. That's purely a rugby thing. As for the shape of the ball, Tom at one point here insisted that the oval ball be used, much to the dismay of his friend JB Thompson. Now, they weren't really an oval ball, right? It was just a rugby ball that had basically been kicked.
They weren't made oval. They were just kicked. The constant kicking and holding the ball just extended stretched the leather into an oval shape.
Yeah, the osmosis of kicking.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, originally the balls were much fatter, and it's only when they started to actually design and manufacture oval balls that we got the modern ball.
Well, I do know that T.W. Sherrin, he invented the ball when he was given a out of shape rugby ball to fix, and because he couldn't fix it exactly because it was ripped, he cut it a little bit shorter and then sewed it together and was like, "Oh, I'll give this a try."
Yeah.
The Melbourne rules spread quickly, and games were being played in Geelong in 1859. Tom's friend at Point Henry, a man named George Glenross Smith, noted in a letter that it was Tom that brought the game of Australian rules to Geelong. Tom first played football with the Melbourne club, then with an early team from Richmond, not the Tigers as we know them, and then he played with Geelong. Most games were played on the Richmond paddock. Occasionally, some games were permitted to be played on the MCG. Tom was regarded as a highly skilled tactician and an astute leader on the field. He was a dominant player whose long kicking was a potent source of goals. The field is an interesting thing. Like, you've got the MCG there. He suggested early in winter practice that it'd be good to have them trampled upon to get them nice and hard for cricket, but he chooses to play next to the MCG. Or I guess he's probably told that he can't play on the MCG. Maybe, I don't know. But that ginormous field that's there and next to the MCG has a scar tree.
Absolutely, yeah.
So where would you play Marngrook? Would it be in a big open field, or would it be amongst trees, or what would that look like?
Would it tend to be in one of the linear fire stick farms? Aboriginal people tended to clear areas in river flats and whatnot to have trees only every 20 or 50 metres apart, and there were grazing areas for kangaroos and emus. They were actually, farms. They were made as that. So there was relatively few trees to dodge between. And when you think of it, to have trees that well spaced, it helped hunters when they were actually, hunting a kangaroo or whatnot. You had, but the whole point is that you played on the river flats or flat areas that had already been cleared and were existing kangaroo and emu farms.
So, do we know what was actually at the site of the MCG before it was the, quote unquote, the Richmond paddock?
No, it's been suggested to me by Aboriginal people that this was also a traditional area where they played Marngrook.
Right. Because it is right near the river, like you said.
It is, yeah, that's right. And these areas were the natural places that well, they weren't the natural; they were the manufactured places that Aboriginal people had. Possum farms were on the sides of hills which were densely bushed and surrounded by an area of open land, because possums don't like going across open land, so they all stay in the one area. But you wouldn't play football in a possum farm because it was a little mini forest.
Yeah, you like the big open space, especially if you're kicking the ball. I'm thinking like you're kicking the ball high in the air, you probably want a lot of open space.
Well, that's right. Yeah.
Otherwise, it's getting caught in the tree like it did in the.
And as I said, along the river flats, they had these linear farms, which for the grazing of kangaroos and emus.
Because they need water, yeah.
Mm.
Yeah. So, in one tactical manoeuvre, which foreshadowed the modern game, Wills, as captain of the Richmond Football Club, positioned his men down the football ground from defence to attack, instructing them to kick the ball directly to one another towards goal. This influence here is a new way of playing a game. It seems to come out of his imagination.
Yes, his imagination, shaped by his previous experience, in childhood and adolescence of playing the game, and so particularly the children's games of biddy, for instance, was kick to kicks. Kids would pair up and kick the ball to each other, and play. There might be half a dozen or a dozen kids or more, who knows? But that's the whole point, that they would position themselves and kick and contest marks and all that sort of stuff.
So if we got, it looks like he's put men down the field, but eventually what would have happened is other players would have gone, oh, I probably should go play on him. And that's where
exactly
the one-on-one contest
exactly
in, which is not really part of any other sport.
No. And it became an integral part of Aussie rules. And so from the Marngrook game, where kids were paired up, opposing people were paired up, you had this process of osmosis where in Aussie rules, as promoted by Tom Wills, you ended up with pairs of players down the field, exactly as previously happened in Marngrook.
Which is, because when you play rugby, you've got a whole team of people that play against.
Yeah, you've got a line.
There's no one-on-one contest.
No, that's right. Even though they talk in terms of opponents, it's only that opponent that's across the battle line.
Yeah. So on another day, when his Melbourne team played South Yarra, there were fewer players than usual, allowing more space to run with the ball. He instructed his players to relinquish the conventional style of play, which was a mass of players clumped together, shoving the ball forward like in a rugby scrum, asking them instead to exploit the lower numbers of players on the field and use the space by darting and running with the ball. Melbourne won. Tom's innovations were brilliant at a time of these unimaginable manoeuvres. Here we're seeing these new concepts coming into his style of play, the freedom to spread out, to run to space, all things that are still part of AFL now.
It didn't come out of nowhere. He had to have had an experiential base to this, because you can't just invent things, very rarely you can, and you rely on these. Sometimes they're just visual memories. They're not actually, sort of processed in verbal form or anything like that.
Possibly from a young age too, unconscious.
Yeah. Well, this is just the way you do it. This is the way it's done. But at some stage, Tom has seen that this is a tactical process that he can employ. Let's do it this way. And he would have, I have no doubt later on that he thought, I've got to mine this previous experience. And he would have thought about his previous experiences. What happened when we played biddy or Marngrook or whatever, or Mingorm.
And even if, to say that he played it, even if he wasn't consciously bringing those things into the game of Melbourne football, what it was called then, things that influence you are all the things that you experience in your life. And sometimes you don't know where those things come from. So I know you have a little bit of an issue with people saying that he never mentioned it. He never mentioned that he got any of these things from Indigenous football, but maybe he didn't know.
Well, maybe he didn't know, and
I'm speculating, but yeah.
maybe he did know and thought, I better not say anything because there's still this entrenched view of Aboriginal people and Aboriginal society. Look, there's another perfect example of that, is that Aboriginal people used to swim overarm. And when the English came out here, they used to all swim breaststroke, and they started observing Aboriginal people with this overarm, and the Australian crawl developed out of that. But we have this weird story about some Hawaiian person came over and taught Australians how to, because there's this automatic denial that Aboriginal people could have had any influence on Australian culture.
Yeah. So in 1859, his cousin Colden Harrison first appeared in football matches. Tom remarked at the time that Colden has turned out to be the best/fastest runner in the colony.
He was too. He was a 400-metre champion. Absolute.
Yeah. In the intercolonial cricket game, over 25,000 people attended the match. Tom's mother and sister travelled to the MCG to watch Tom captain the Victorian team. He top scored with 24 runs and the Victorians won by 69. We're up to 1860 now. Well, sorry, I should say 1860 to 1863. So he's 25 to 28 years old. In 1860, the bowling rules read, the bowler could not have his hand above the shoulder at the point of delivery. Tom dismissed this law, stating that bowlers ought to be allowed to bowl as high as they like, as long as they do not throw or jerk the ball. Seems like he's pioneering a modern style of bowling.
And of course, if you're doing round arm and leaning to the side, you can actually elevate your arm a little bit higher, but it's not above the shoulder because you're sloping to one side.
Yeah, and I think it's not ever stated, but I'm just interested to see what you think, because throwing the ball or getting called for throwing, which is what happens to him later, it could have been because he jerked his elbow, but it could also be because his arm went above his shoulder.
I think that's more likely.
Yeah, me too, actually. Yeah. Okay, so in April the same year, 1860, Horatio proclaimed to his family, Tom has now retired from cricket. His father had summoned him to join him on the trek to Cullinaringo, and Tom stated, I have entirely given up cricket, so you will not hear from me playing in any grand matches. The English 11 were on tour at this time, and Tom would be 2,000 miles away in the Queensland bush. Why do you think he would willingly retire from cricket right before possibly the greatest match of his career?
He desperately wanted to win his father's approval. When he got sent to rugby, his father wanted him to be a lawyer and all that sort of stuff. He still lived for his father's approval, and I think his decision to state that he was retiring was a conflicted one, but it was, in a sense, political, because it's what his father wanted.
Yeah. So Horatio might have thought that Tom had given up cricket, but he'd secretly made arrangements to play in both Sydney and Melbourne. Just before they left for Queensland, Horatio penned a fresh will. And this is interesting. It stated, in the event of my son, Thomas Wentworth Wills, misconducting himself, the trustees of the station are authorised to remove Tom from the management of the station. And if that be the case, Tom shall not participate in the final distribution of my estates, and in lieu of his part or share shall receive for the term of his natural life the yearly sum of £100 and no more. £100?
£100, $200.
Inflation, maybe.
It was probably about a double, what an ordinary worker would get.
For a year? Or?
For a year, yeah.
So he's pretty much sorted then, even if it doesn't work. So, okay. Excuse me. Before leaving, Tom was trained in blacksmithing. He worked with anvils, hot tongs, and learnt to shoe horses, and he also learnt to work with shears. At the end of January 1861, Tom and Horatio departed Melbourne by steamer for Sydney, and arriving in Moreton Bay in Queensland on the 27th of January. On the 5th of February, they assembled a team of men, women, and children. They loaded 5 trays and over 100 rams. They had a large number of half-bred hounds to protect the party. The drays were pulled by bullocks. Bullocks, which you told me the other day, is male cows or oxen.
Yeah, that's right.
They left for Brisbane and went through Ipswich. And when they got to Toowoomba, a bullock, a dog, and a man had died. The man had drowned. So it's a pretty crazy journey heading up this way.
Absolutely.
On the Darling Downs, they collected 10,000 head of sheep. In late June, they were held up in Rockhampton on the Fitzroy River and decided on a different route to Colonaringo. At the time, Queensland employed a native police force to disperse Aboriginal gatherings. As they moved closer to their destination, Horatio and Tom began sleeping beneath tarpaulin, which is just basically tarp, tents, with both ends open, and they burnt small pats of cow dung as they slept to keep away the mosquitoes. Old school trick.
Exactly. Works very well.
Would it stink, though?
Oh, not too bad.
Yeah. Horatio did this because he didn't want to attract the local Aborigines with a large fire, and noted that one night he heard the dog growl. Upon getting up, revolver in hand, he saw nothing but suspected that they were close. So the party then moved north, passing through Wentworth Station, which was managed by a man named Jesse Gregson, about 20 miles from Colonaringo. Gregson was in his early 20s and had arrived in the area several months before. On the 3rd of October, they departed Wentworth Station and crossed Separation Creek, the boundary of Gregson's property and Colonaringo. After they arrived, Horatio wrote in his diary, "Thank heaven, Colonaringo at last." They settled next to a cool creek bed with plenty of shade and running water. You could see why I'd be happy. It was an 8-month journey.
Yeah.
Mr. Cave of the Native Police came to visit the camp and gave news that Horatio now had a new daughter, his 9th child, to which he didn't even know was on the way. He'd been away for so long, 8 months, In the surrounding bush, the local Aboriginal tribes could be heard, and shouts every now and then and return calls from beyond the scrub were heard. Every so often, small groups of Aboriginal men and women entered the camp, and a strange game of half-understood gestures and mimicry took place between the settlers and the Aborigines. What's happening there, Jim? The mimicry, the misunderstood gestures. They're trying to get to know them, yeah?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. It's rather interesting when you refer to the native police too. They had a strategy of getting out of country Aboriginals to be part of teams, off their own country, so they wouldn't mind killing other Aboriginal people because they weren't of their mob.
Right. So these native police weren't the mob that was there.
No, that's right. They were, purposely imported from out of their country so that they would have no compunction about killing blackfellas.
On the 13th of October, 7 days after arriving, Tom and 2 other men took a team of bullocks and 2 empty drays back to Albina Downs to collect provisions. What's a dray?
It's just a cart. It's a flat cart.
Oh, okay. So like a wooden cart, but just no structure.
No sides.
Yep. It took them several days to make the trip, and when they returned, his father and 18 other settlers were dead. This was the single largest massacre of colonists by Aboriginal people in Australian history. 2 mass graves were dug for all the victims, except Horatio, whom was respectfully given a grave to himself. Prior to the massacre, some of Gregson's sheep had been taken by the local Aboriginal mob, and this indiscretion had resulted in the murder of several local Aboriginals. The report from the massacre is pretty full on. I'm just gonna read through it. On the morning of the 18th, about 1 o'clock, a man, John Moore, arrived at Wentworth Station and reported to Mr. Gregson that he had just come from Mr. Wills' camp, where he had been employed, and that the blacks had attacked the camp on the afternoon of the 17th, and as far as he knew, had killed all the party, with the exception of another man and himself. The informant stated the blacks had been about the camp on the morning of the 17th and then left, and feeling tired and exhausted with the heat, he had lain down in the shade of a bush to have a rest, but fell asleep.
He was bludging.
Yeah, bludger. He was awakened by hearing loud noises, and on looking out from his resting place, he saw several of the blacks attacking a white woman, who soon fell from their blows. Then screams, shouts, and sounds of dull blows followed, clearly convincing him that all of his companions were being murdered. In the midst of all the noise, the report of a pistol was heard, but the informant could not see who fired the shot. As to obtain a better view of the camp, he would have to have exposed himself. After keeping quiet for a considerable amount of time, a flock of sheep passed by, drawing towards the camp, and shortly afterwards the shepherd followed, quite unconscious of what had happened. So the sheep have come past and he's hid amongst the sheep and got out of there. As all now seemed quiet, both men walked toward the tents, where they saw the bodies of several of the victims. About 20 yards in front of Mr. Wills's tent, his horse, Simon, was standing tied up to a dray, saddled and ready for use. The horse was secured by the informant, who at once started to report the occurrence, and reached Wentworth Station the same night, as I have already told you. So the man left behind, his name was Ned Kenny, and it would be difficult to imagine his feelings alone with the ghastly dead around him. His first thoughts naturally of self-preservation. He'd been in Horatio's appointment in the early 1840s in Victoria, and he has a version of the story too, and this is it. And this one's a bit more graphic. The flock of sheep I was herding were feeding all day to the north of the camp. About sundown, my sheep drew in towards the camp, and, when close to the creek on which the tents are pitched, another man met me, and we walked up to the camp together. I remarked to my mate, "The camp seems very quiet. I shall go to the master's tent and see if there's anything wrong." On reaching the tent, I was horrified to see the master dead, lying close to the tent door, about 20 yards from the tent. The horse was saddled up, ready for use. We both made for the horse, but my mate reached him first and at once got into the saddle. I implored him to let me get up behind him, as the horse was a fine, strong animal and very quiet, but he refused to let me ride. He then said he would ride to Wentworth Station and report the murder, and started off at once. I followed on foot, but after I had run for about 2 miles, I became exhausted and fell down in the long grass, where I laid until I was found the next day by 3 horsemen Mr. Gregson had sent over, well armed, to see if there were any survivors. Mr. Gregson immediately sent word to his nearest neighbours, and the news was forwarded as rapidly as possible throughout the district. The native police were then about 200 miles away, and a letter was sent to the officer in charge requesting his presence as soon as possible. Only 50 hours elapsed from when the massacre was reported until the news had reached the native police, who at once started for the scene of the murder. On the Friday at sundown, Gregson, McIntosh, and several other gentlemen, some of their men and 2 black boys, started for the scene of the massacre, where they arrived about midnight and camped until daylight. In the morning, 13 of the victims, including Mr. Wills, were found at the head of the station or main camp. 3 others, Baker, the overseer, David Baker, his son, and a shepherd, were found 1.5 miles down the creek, where they were forming a camp for a flock of ewes and lambs. These 3 men had evidently been erecting a tent when they were attacked, and seemed to have taken up a position against the bloodwood tree, close to which their bodies were found. They had tent poles near them, and appeared to have made a fight for their lives. The blacks had evidently struck one of the men with one of their own axes. His leg was nearly severed by the blow. The tree against which they had stood bore the marks of blows from nullas, which the blacks had evidently thrown at the men, and had missed their mark and struck the tree instead. Mr. Wills was found lying on his back about 2 yards from the tent door. There was a deep tomahawk wound in his right cheek, the neck being severed a few inches below the same spot by a larger wound, probably an axe cut. The head, besides, had been beaten with nullas, and close beside him his revolver lay on the ground with one chamber empty. A few yards from Mr. Wills, Margaret Mannion, a girl about 10 years of age, was killed by nulla blows on her head. She had been sitting in the shade of her father's tent, nursing her little sister and reading a Catholic prayer book. The baby, a few months old, was killed. A few yards away, their mother, Mrs. Mannion, her daughter, about 6 years of age, were all killed in the same manner. James Scott, cook, was found dead, lying nearly on his face with a spear still in him. It had penetrated his abdomen. He also bore several wounds on his head. Mrs. Baker, the overseer's wife, was found partly undressed at the side of her tent, killed by blows on the head. Her daughter, 20 years old, found lying at the door of the tent, partly undressed, a boy 6 years of age and an infant 7 months old. Both Mrs. Baker's children were found in the same tent and were killed in a similar manner. Near the bushyard, about 50 yards from the tents, Patrick Mannion was found lying on his back. He had evidently had a struggle for life, and he was stripped to his waist. His head had a deep tomahawk wound upon it, and bore traces of nulla marks. Another man found dead inside the yard had nothing on except a flannel shirt. Near the same fence was found George, the bullock driver, with his whip still grasped in his hands. Henry Watt, an old shepherd, was found about a mile out on the plain. All were killed in the same manner. These were all the bodies discovered, but 2 men were still missing. The party decided to bury the bodies at once, so they dug a large grave to which the body of Mr. Wills was placed. The last tribute of respect to Mr. Wills was performed by the nearest neighbours. After the burial service was read over the bodies, the graves were filled in, and the party then set about collecting goods that had been scattered about by the blacks. Some were told to search for the sheep. All but a few hundred were subsequently recovered. The camp was a wreck. The blacks had taken nearly all the goods they could find in the tents, but they had left sugar, tea, tobacco, and flour untouched. They had broken all the boxes and cases, taking all the contents with them, consisting of books, papers, crockery, tools, blankets, axes, tomahawks, knives, etc., and clothes of every description. As soon as the blacks had accomplished their deadly work, they at once made off in the direction of the timbered country to the west, where, under the cover of the dense brigalow scrub, they thought themselves secure. On Sunday, 8 of the party went out to run the blacks' tracks. They went for about 5 miles until they reached where the blacks had camped for the first night after the murder. During the day, the party came across the remains of sheep the blacks had driven away and killed, and on reaching the deserted camp in the scrub, they found an immense variety of articles the blacks had abandoned after their first day's march. They then returned to the scene of the murder and told their companions the directions the blacks had gone. Tom Wills returned to the scene of the massacre on Sunday afternoon, the 20th of October, having received...
So how long after the massacre that Tom returns?
I'll have a look and I'll put it up on screen to see how it was, because it's important. And why I'm reading this in detail is because I'm going to talk about that article that came out, because this is the account, and that's an interesting one. About sundown, the bodies of the 2 missing men were found about half a mile from the camp, where they had been murdered close to the road to Wentworth Station. Their names were George Elliott, a Victorian cricketer, and a man named Tom. They were buried where they were found on Monday morning, the 21st of October. It was now decided that the drays should be loaded up and the sheep taken back to a spot about 6 miles from Wentworth Station. A party of 11 men then started in pursuit of the blacks. The tracks were easily followed, except occasionally when they crossed over patches of rocky ground. When the party reached the Nungo River, still following the tracks, they came upon a heap of articles which the blacks had left behind, but evidently with the intention of calling for them at some future time, as they were carefully covered with sheets of bark. The party knew now that they were on the right track, and about 2 hours before sundown, they were able to locate the blacks' camp in a patch of, I think it's brigalow scrub, near a mountain now called Snake Range, about 20 miles from the scene of the slaughter. Early on Wednesday morning, the party quietly surrounded the camp and waited for daylight. One of the party had been left behind a short distance in charge of the horses. It was agreed that the gentleman who was appointed leader was to fire the first shot, so they anxiously awaited daylight. As soon as the day began to break, the blacks began to sit up and stir their fires. One big blackfellow stood up with a paper in his hand and pretended to read it to the other. This little incident seemed to cause some merriment to those who were awake. However, he knew little that vengeance was so near. At the very moment he was acting the white fellow, the leader of the whites was taking deadly aim, and in a second of stillness of the morning was broken by the loud, I think it says report, but is that...
Yeah, report, yeah.
The loud report.
Echoing sound,
of the rifle, and the blackfellow, with the paper still in hand, fell dead. All was now confusion. The affray, is that
Yep.
right? Lasted only a few minutes, but several blacks lay dead when they had been peacefully sleeping only a short time before. The party now returned to Rainworth Station, where they found a detachment of native police under the command of Lieutenant Cave, who started in pursuit of the blacks on Thursday, the 24th of October. The punishment meted out to the murders was very severe, and of the many who took an active part in the massacre, few lived to tell the tale. Time passed, but nearly every year single murders were committed in the district, in every instance isolated shepherds being the victims. These murders were always followed by the native police report having dispersed a camp of blacks. About the year 1870, the blacks were again let into Colonaringo, and sometimes there were 200 collected at the camp. Whenever the native police were patrolling the district and passing in the vicinity, the blacks would collect on the head station as if seeking protection. When some of the boys began to speak our language, we found out the cause of the murder. They say that a short time previous to Mr. Wills and party's arrival on the station, some of their tribe found a small mob of sheep straying in the bush. A mob some shepherd had lost. Those sheep were driven up a small ridge, and a good many of them were slaughtered by the blacks and eaten. While still in possession of the sheep, they were surprised by the native police and a couple of white men, and 2 of them were shot. The remainder escaped and told the rest of the blacks what had happened. They then resolved to muster up all the blacks in the district belonging to the tribe and killed the people who had shot their mates. Their law, if a man kills another, the relatives of the dead man will always kill the murderer if possible. But if they cannot get hold of the murderer, they will kill some of his relatives, the father or brother preferred. Relatives failing, some of his tribe, if he happens to be a stranger. In the meantime, Mr. Wills's party happened to arrive at Colonaringo and pitched their tents close to where the blacks were mustering, so they made up their minds to kill them to avenge the death of the 2 blacks shot for sheep stealing.
That seems to me to be a very accurate representation of what actually happened.
I have been told this by 2 blacks who were present at the murder, and also had a statement corroborated by 2 gins. Gins?
Yeah, women,
who were spectators. The pistol shot heard during the massacre was fired by Mr. Wills at a blackfellow who was in front of his tent. The bullet grazed the inside of his right arm, but before Mr. Wills had time to shoot again, he was seized from behind by 2 powerful blacks and held fast while others finished the work. The blacks also say that even had a few of their numbers been shot at the time of the murder, they would not have been deterred from carrying out their purpose, as they were then not afraid of the whitefellows or their guns. Neither the young women nor the young blackfellows wanted the whites killed, but the young men were ultimately persuaded to join in the massacre.
I'd put a lot of weight to that account. The person seems to have a good understanding of Aboriginal culture and behavioural norms, and it tends to fit the fact that they took revenge on somebody nearby who was on the same area of land where there had been shot, friends had been killed. It as I said, it has a lot of credibility, a ring of credibility about it.
So, despairing and vengeful, Wills, Tom, first wrote to Harrison in Melbourne listing the victims and requesting that he send replacements. Over the following weeks, police, native police and vigilante groups from neighbouring stations drove the Aboriginals to near the Gari people, Gayeri? To near extinction, and estimated 370 were killed. Due to a dearth of evidence, it's been said that Wills took no part in the counter massacres.
Well, I think the timelines explained shows clearly that Wills was not there and had not arrived back when the original revenge party was set off. Yeah. So when they refer to the leader, it's obviously not Tom Wills.
So the question of his participation in this was raised in 2021 after a report in an anonymous Chicago Tribune article dating back to 1895, which is after he's dead, which quotes Tom as saying during the raid on the Aboriginal camp, he and other Avengers killed all in sight. Now, this was a big story in the paper last year.
Yep.
But the ABC, when they wrote the article, they just cherry-picked some of the things from the article, and I actually used it as an example in my class of how you can take a piece of evidence out of context.
Exactly right.
You needed to read the whole article, and the whole article was never available for them. I had to go searching to find it. And when I found it, it's really interesting to read what was actually said in it, because there's so many incongruities with it.
Yeah, and glaring inconsistencies.
Yeah. So each time I one of those pops up, just say, hey. So this is the article. It's called Old Days in Australia. Sometime in the 60s, a family of the name of Wills immigrated from England and settled on a nice sheep run in Victoria. The family consisted of a father, a mother, a son, and 3 daughters. He just had his 9th child.
Yeah, that's right,
So that's wrong. The son, Tommy Wills, had been captain of rugby school and also captain of the cricket club, and on his departure from Australia was esteemed as one of the most popular cricketers in England. Being a great power among the members of the Isingari, a very swell club. I met him in a small town in Victoria, and one night after dinner I prevailed upon him to tell me the following story, which I give in his own words. Well, we'd been out here for 3 years and had settled down comfortably and were doing well.
That's ridiculous.
They just
been here for 20 years.
Well, no, that's him saying that they've gotten to Cullen and Ringo and they've been there for 3 years.
No,
they've been there for 2 minutes. It was.
But I think he might have been thinking that he'd been in Australia 3 years, which was totally wrong.
It could be that, but the next line is, it was just before Christmas and I had to drive 200 head of cattle and take a lot of wool down to Melbourne and return with the good things for Christmas.
Well, it wasn't. That was, the timelines are completely wrong. So this is not what Tom Wills is saying at all.
Well, he also drove 200 head of cattle down to Melbourne. It's a long way.
It's a long way.
Just to take 200 of them as well.
From northern Queensland.
But also, he didn't do that. He just went back to get food.
Yeah.
I sold everything, stayed an extra day to see the English fellows play cricket, had a jolly time, and started off with a light heart and laden with presents for home. We had gotten within about 20 miles from home when something came over me. I cannot explain it. It seemed as if life had gone out of me, or rather not from me, but from someone dear to me. I felt so sick that I got off the pony and told the drivers we would camp for a time. We had a good drink, but that did me no good. Oh God, the agony I suffered during that 25-mile ride, fearful of going too fast, yet wishing to be rid of the awful suspense. At last we got to the edge of the bush, and in 2 minutes more I knew my fears would be verified. Old chap, if I ever offered up an honest prayer, I did that moment. And then, when we came within sight of the house, I cannot understand it. They didn't have a house.
No.
I had become quite calm, and the sight which met my gaze did not seem to surprise me in the least. In fact, I believe I had a cynical smile on my face to think how clever I was in divining that something was wrong. And, my God, there was something wrong. For there, old man, before the very door, were the heads of mother, father, and 3 sisters stuck on sticks and placed in a row.
This is pure theatric fabrication. He wasn't there. He wasn't the first back on the scene.
And he arrives back from Melbourne.
Yeah, and it was, he arrived, 4 or 5 days after the massacre?
Yeah, I think it was 3 days, 3 or 4, yeah. And heads on sticks, that's
South American Indian sort of stuff.
Well, I guess it is an American newspaper, so he's maybe projecting a little bit there. I didn't blubber like this then. I seemed to have turned to stone. I turned to the drovers who were crying like children and ordered them to gallop to the neighbouring runs and spread the news. Before morning, 30 good men and true were at the door, among them 2 native trackers who were friendly to us, who said that there were about 40 in the gang. If you ever saw men set to kill, it was these. There was death to the devils written on every face. After 8 hours galloping, we came up to the band about 3 o'clock.
You cannot gallop horses for 8 hours. It does not happen. A horse will founder. It's quite impossible.
What a shout went up as we sighted them. How I galloped down upon them. I cannot tell all that happened, but know we killed all in sight. Just as we thought they were all settled, I happened to see a dirty, shrinking, greasy brute with my Zingari jacket on sneaking off. Oh, the desecration of it. Fancy my Zingari jacket. Oh, didn't I gallop after him, and when I got alongside, I emptied the whole 6 barrels of my revolver into him, the brute. Such was poor old Tommy Wills's tale, but the pathos with which he surrounded it, and the indignation expressed at the fellow who dared wear his Zingari jacket, cannot be portrayed in cold print. Tommy, poor fellow, took to the drink and became a perfect wreck, and if anyone has ever had an excuse for doing so, surely he had. It was woe betide any native that came across Tommy Wills, for he was allowed to have a sort of general prescriptive right to rid the country of what he called D-D vermin. But then, all this was in the good old days, and then it just simply says G. dot.
Just an absolute pack of rubbish. It has no integrity, no factual basis to it. Has got so many flaws in it, it's unbelievable. And yet it just shows you the ethical standards of journalism nowadays. People are only concerned in controversy, and it surely created controversy. But the damage that did within the Aboriginal community to the sort of process of reconciliation. I wrote to an Aboriginal person in the with a pretty good office in one of the organisations, said, that we should tear down the statue of Tom Wills. So I wrote and said, look, this is absolute rubbish, but never got a response.
Yeah, I guess it's called clickbait now.
Yeah.
And the more sensational it is, the more it'll get views and the more ad revenue they'll make.
It's just absolutely unbelievable the way in which, that even, social media now will pick up on things and not bother to fact check any of it. And it's just so unbelievably irresponsible. I would like to know what happened to his Zingari jacket and, that sort of stuff. But it's just, it's a travesty that this was given the publicity that it had, and it set back. Australian rules football is a socially integrative game, and so is Marngrook. It brings people together. And to me, the vehicle to use the link between Marngrook and Aussie rules as a way of reconciling all Australians, I think is an important process. And this has done so much damage, that it's incredible.
Yeah. So, in the press, Horatio was accused of ignoring warnings and allowing Aboriginal people to encroach on his property. The retribution was also deemed excessive, and Tom vehemently defended his father against any perceived criticism. Privately, in a letter to Harrison, he admitted, "If we had just used common precaution, all would have been well." It was later revealed that prior to leaving the camp, Tom had a sort of presentiment. Is that right?
Yeah.
Presentiment, which is like an intuitive foreboding.
Seeing
feeling.
The future, yeah.
Yeah. And advised those remaining to arm themselves, including Horatio, who assured him, "It is only your boyish fears."
Well, Horatio was totally self-confident in his ability to manage men, black or white. And that was, part of his undoing, but what he didn't know was what had already unfolded out of his control. And if all things being equal, he would have been right.
No Murrungurk's law up in Queensland.
No, that's right. Yeah.
Tom never articulated his version of the events in writing, but his brother Cedric wrote years later that it was an act of revenge for the attacks made on the local Aboriginal people by Jesse Gregson, a neighbouring squatter who they mistook for Horatio, which we talked about in the article. Cedric wrote to Tom saying, "If the truth is ever known, you will find that it was through Gregson shooting those blacks that was the cause of the murders."
Absolutely.
Yeah. In the years following the massacre, Wills experienced flashbacks, nightmares, and an irritable heart, symptoms of what is now known as post-traumatic stress disorder.
Absolutely. And that was behind his drinking.
Having eagerly participated, that's my next line actually, having eagerly participated in drinking culture in colonial sport, he increased his alcohol consumption and in a likely attempt to blot out memories and alleviate sleep disturbances. Wills' sister Emily wrote of him 2 months after the massacre. He says he has never felt so changed in the whole course of his life. Of course, it's a huge thing.
And he'd, in a sense, failed his father. He not only lost his father, but he was trying to re-establish himself, and it's all lost.
And the journey up there together must have been a really father and son trip, like...
Yeah, I think it was, going to be his renaissance in that way.
Yeah. Wills made a vow over Horatio's grave to remain on Colonaringa and make it the pride of Queensland. He began to rebuild the station pending the arrival of his uncle-in-law William Rope, who took control of Colonaringa in December 1861, but soon left due to Wills' exceedingly ill treatment of him, probably because he was drunk. Hypervigilant, Wills slept only 3 hours a night with a rifle within reach and watched for signs of another Aboriginal attack, so he's got that paranoia thing happening at the same time. Bushrangers and wildlife also posed threats, and for several weeks, sandy blight left him half blind. What's sandy blight?
I think it's a fly infection.
Of the eye?
Yeah, of the eyes, yeah.
Short of station hands, he at times led a solitary life of a shepherd. There is no, and this is him saying, "There is no one up here to love old Tom, but old Tom and the gum trees and the little lambs," he wrote to his mother. He went to Sydney in January 1863 to captain Victoria against New South Wales on the Domain. A run-out dispute led to Wills' decision to abandon play. A crowd riot ensued, with the Cabbage Tree mob stoning and beating the Victorians with sticks. Wills received a severe blow in the face from a stone before escaping the ground with his men under police escort. Despite this, with only a 9-man batting order due to William Greaves and George Marshall having fled the city, Wills agreed to resume play the next day. He took 8 wickets and top scored in both innings, making 25 and 17, but it was not enough to secure victory. Never gives up, does he? Not when it comes to sport. The Melbourne media castigated Wills, is that right? Castigated, I should say. Wills for allowing the game to resume. And Sydney siders called him a turncoat for reneging on an earlier promise to play for New South Wales. He denied all accusations and wrote in an angry letter to the Sydney Herald, "I, for one, do not think Victoria will ever send the 11 up here again." Back in Victoria, he became engaged to a lady named Julie Anderson, a squatter's daughter. He seems to have done so to meet familial expectations. In May, as his mother grew concerned over his neglect of Colonaringa, Wills extended his sojourn south in order to play football in Geelong. Sojourn means like you stay for a little while, yeah?
What was the word?
Sojourn?
Sojourn.
Sojourn,
yeah.
Yeah, which is like he's...
It's staying a while.
Yeah, like a temporary stay, yeah.
Yeah.
Wills finally returned to Queensland in May and was sworn in as a Justice of the Peace upon arrival in Brisbane. Over the next few months at Colonaringa, he reported to the press at least 3 fatal Aboriginal attacks on local colonists, a shepherd of his numbering among the victims. He accosted government officials for failing to send the native police detachment to his station for protection and scorned city dwellers for sympathising with the plight of Aboriginal people in the Nogoa region, Nogoa. With the cricket season approaching, Wills agreed to captain Queensland against New South Wales. Jeez, he plays for anyone, doesn't he? And then left the colony to lead the Victorian 22 at the MCG against George Parr's All-English 11. In awe of his 1,800-mile dash across the continent to play cricket, the English thought it was a madman's journey. Long way to go for a game of cricket. Wills arrived on the final day of the match to a rapturous reception. and went in as a substitute fielder. He then joined the Visitors on their Victorian tour. The 1863-64 season saw Wills' engagement to Anderson collapse, possibly due to being a womanizer, and the trustees of Cullenaringa accused him of mismanaging the property, in part squandering his family finances on alcohol while claiming it as a station expenditure.
Sounds right.
He wouldn't be the first guy to do something like that as an alcoholic. They demanded that he stay in Victoria to answer for the property's runaway debt. In response, Wills left Australia to join Pars 11 on a month-long tour of New Zealand. Initially standing in as umpire, he went on to captain the local teams against the English and filled the same role for the Victorian 22 at the end of the tour in Melbourne. He faced the trustees soon after, can't get away forever. With his mother's reluctant approval, they dismissed him from Cullenaringa, thus fulfilling the premonition of Horatio's will.
Exactly right.
Yeah.